Hi, I'm James McGuire, and on today's eSpeaks, we're talking about using software to protect our physical security. That is, buildings, offices, data centers, as opposed to our email or our work logins. We're far past the point where simply using keys and locks can keep our facilities safe. We now need the sophistication of software to help us out. To discuss that, I'm joined by Manish Mehta, Chief Product Officer at Ontic Technologies. Manish, happy Friday to you, and thanks so much for being with us.
James, happy Friday to you, and we're delighted to be part of this podcast and to participate today.
So, as you survey the industry, looking at companies that are using software for physical security, what are a couple of key trends that you see in 2022? I mean, I sense that the idea of using software to boost physical security is certainly on the rise. What's your take?
Absolutely. And maybe to set context, let's talk a little bit about what's been happening over the
Please.
last couple of years. First,
Yes.
if you think of the physical threat landscape, it has been expanding in ways that are unprecedented. I mean, think of the basic and the more mundane, whether it's workplace violence, insider threats, individuals who have an executive fixation. It could be
Hmm.
due to corporate policy. It could be
Sure.
to the field that the company is in. And these threats are coming in from so many different mechanisms. Now think of the change: domestic extremism, foreign
Hmm.
state actors, health
Hmm.
related issues.
Hmm.
So if you think about a physical security team, one, they're dealing with an expanding threat landscape without expanding the resources that they have. Two, they're dealing with an overwhelming amount of data that's unmanageable, right? All of these signals are coming in, and they
Hmm.
have antiquated tools. And
Hmm.
James, if you look at the antiquated tools they have in physical security, which is very different than cyber, they've been using paper. They have filing
Hmm.
cabinets. They have
That's just a little bit outdated, right?
walkie-talkies, right? So
Hmm.
we saw this as an opportunity to disrupt this market. So increasing threats, more signals, antiquated tools, great opportunity to disrupt that market.
Hmm. So, what is a common problem the companies run into when they want to use software for physical security? I'm sure that's not always easy. I mean, what's a challenge that the companies run into, and what advice might you give them?
Many challenges. One of them
Hmm.
is they have a set of antiquated systems or disconnected and siloed tools. So let's talk about each. In
Hmm.
terms of disconnected and siloed tools, companies do often invest in social media listening. They have a separate tool to monitor the dark web. They have a separate tip line for anonymous tips that come in. They might have their own CRM system for their call center if somebody comes in to threaten an executive or the company themselves.
Hmm.
There may be threatening letters that are written. There may be vehicles that approach and an unwanted visitor comes to the lobby.
Hmm.
What's the technology solution in those cases that are completely disconnected and siloed? And then you
Hmm.
couple that with antiquated technology, where a guard at the gate observes a suspicious vehicle. How does that guard log that incident? Do they call it in on a walkie-talkie? Do they write it in on a log sheet, an incident report? And how
Hmm.
does all of that get combined? So my recommendation would be to invest in companies and software and technology vendors
Hmm.
that can synthesize and correlate all of that information together. We call it collecting and connecting the dots. So
Hmm.
you can invest in technology that can collect these dots from across these channels and then connect them together to build that complete picture. That's going to be key.
Hmm. Well, what is your sense of where companies are with this process? Are they fairly new to it, or they're adopting it mainstream, but it hasn't fully grown a lot yet? I mean, what's going on in the marketplace in terms of adoption?
James, just like any type of transformation that occurs in the market, you're going to have the early adopters, and then you'll have the need to cross the chasm to the
Hmm.
late majority. What's happening today is we are seeing a shift. There are companies. We put out a state of protective intelligence report. That's the market that we're in, protective intelligence,
Okay.
for 2022. And it was remarkable to see the resonance of needing technology and software that can collect and connect these dots and stitch them together to allow you to see around corners. Because what's been happening today, and I think this will make sense to you and your listeners, is physical security has been entirely reactive. The
Mm.
moment an incident happens, everyone jumps on that moment without any context at all. So if you were to write a threatening letter to the CEO of a company, a
Hmm.
large Fortune 500 company, or you were to come to the front desk and want to see a senior executive, or there was workplace violence, or there was an insider who resigned from the company and decided to steal or take away IP, all you're doing as a physical security team is focusing on that moment and how to mitigate that current threat. But what you often don't have is your history. Hey, James, have you actually written to the company before? Were you talking on social media about the company? Oh, you happen to be a former employee that had written IP that you felt was unfairly stolen by the company. And if we had produced this entire review, and then we recognized that you had also filed for bankruptcy, you had a series of life events, you were cited for criminal activity a couple of years ago, you were indicted for fraud. Well, now the security team has a more complete picture. Rather than just being reactive, you get to see that whole picture and be proactive.
So there is a sense, to a certain extent, it is prescriptive. It attempts to look into the future of what might happen, but then still, it sounds like the company would need to follow a certain individual for a while to really get that history laid out.
That is true. And the way we think about it is not, if you think of a physical threat as a hurricane, right? Think of that as a transient event. You know, a few days before that this hurricane's likely coming. The hurricane has arrived, you're putting your procedures in place to mitigate risk, and then the hurricane's gone. Think of that as a transient event. But if you think about humans and humans as potential threat actors, well, they have a much longer history, not only days, weeks, months, but maybe even years in advance. And it could be an individual that threatened an executive, or maybe it was a domestic violence case where their former spouse still works at the company and they want to come to the company to commit harm. Well, if that person then gets incarcerated, James, and then put away for 5 years, when they come out of prison, they could still be a near and present danger and a threat to that company. So very different than a transient event. Think of these as recursive events that are perpetual.
So let's talk about Ontic in particular. How is Ontic addressing the security needs of its clients? I mean, what is the Ontic Advantage?
The Ontic Advantage is really simple. We collect and connect these pre-incident threat indicators to prevent bad things from happening. So take, for instance, your public data, whether it's social media, the dark web, it could be weather-related events, it could be real-time news events that are happening in and around a facility. It could then be the threat actors that you have that are known to you. It could be new threat actors because of new threats that are coming in. Well, I would challenge us to think about any software tool that actually consolidates and stores all of that in a central database. And then what we do is we also connect to a company's private data. It could be their IoT devices. It could be their license plate reading cameras, their visitor management system, their own CRM systems. And when you collect and connect all of that data together, James, you actually don't need sophisticated AI. You just need simple patterns, anomaly recognition and detection to determine what might happen next with that threat actor. And you can start to see it escalating. And as those threats escalate and that concern increases, the security team has that complete picture to make that determination. So think of Ontic's Advantage as the system that collects and connects all of that data in one system to give companies that proactive, complete picture of a threat.
Interesting. So you mentioned AI in there. Does that mean that Ontic is using AI, or it's not, it doesn't need it because of other things it does?
We use simple rules, which is the first step to get to machine learning and AI. We'll continue to advance machine learning and true AI capabilities, but you'd be surprised when you can rationalize or normalize data that come from any type of system. Let's say an anonymous tip comes from a tip line about an employee. And let's say simultaneously, your own HR system acknowledges there's an employee who has threatened their manager. And let's say that same person that night goes on social media and starts ranting about that manager or that employee or that company. Let's say that same person then, James, to use a cyber example, gets on the network at 2 a.m. and starts accessing the network to download files. Let's say at 4 a.m., James, that same employee drives to the facility and starts accessing the access control system to get in the building. And
Mhm.
finally, at 8 a.m., that same employee drives to the gate of the CEO's residence.
Mm.
We can collect and connect all of those systems together. You don't need sophisticated AI per se, but you
Mhm.
just need to stitch those dots together to say it's the same individual, and you can see that pattern.
So it's really it's about connecting intelligence. Well, let's look into the future then. I'd love to get your sense of the future of protective intelligence software. What are a couple of key milestones we can expect in the years ahead?
Absolutely. Well, let's start with the State of Protective Intelligence report that we published
Sure.
earlier this year. First, we surveyed 300 to 400 very senior C-suite leaders. So these are individuals who have run security teams, general counsel, security, safety, and compliance. And they responded back with some really interesting takeaways. The first one was global, James, is taking precedence over local. And this is
Uh-huh.
long before the Ukrainian crisis. The notion that corporate, the large enterprises, are focusing outward and in the geopolitical theater means that the local investments are unchallenged. So there's an opportunity, we think, that is missed on the local front when it comes
Mhm.
to security. The
Mhm.
second is the threat landscape is absolutely expanding. That's coming out loud and clear in the survey. So the threat landscape of all of the risks that I had mentioned, including now a remote workforce,
Mhm.
right? Health related concerns, and all of the extremists, whether it could be protest groups or extreme groups, in
Sure.
addition to threats from within and threats externally, are expanding dramatically.
Mhm.
Third, there's a misplaced sense of safety that security teams and companies are projecting to their own employee base. So they're underrepresenting the actual threats that are happening in the company. As a result of that, they haven't invested in the proper training, they haven't invested in the proper tools, and they've been largely reactive, as we said. So think of the confluence of these events, James, as you think about the year or the years ahead.
Mhm.
Focus external globally, leaving the local maybe unmanaged or not fully managed. The rise in threats, the rise in data means that these security teams are going to be overwhelmed,
Mhm.
giving the posture and position that all is well. Meanwhile, right, the training, the resources, the facilities aren't there. In the same breath, in this report, James, they're saying the need to consolidate intelligence and intelligence teams and tools is paramount importance.
Mm.
So
Right.
this speaks to a great opportunity now to invest in tools and technology of what's likely to come. That we believe there is a tsunami that's likely to come. Think of what's been happening as post-pandemic.
Mhm.
Think of behavioral and mental health. Think of people who have been out of work. All of that pressure with just general stress, we think is going to lead to more of these unfortunate physical events, threat
Mm.
events and risks. So the need for software to consolidate all of this intelligence, we think is going to be critical.
Hmm. I believe, unfortunately, I think you're probably right about that. Manish, thank you so much for sharing your expertise today. I learned a lot. Totally appreciate it.
James, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.